Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod, or at Rockfin. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel and on Rockfin. Our guest today is Mark Sleboda. We talk about the state of affairs in Ukraine with the current Zelensky administration and the new U.S. administration policies, which involve a lot of old geopolitical rhetoric. We also talk about the escalation in the Donbas and the Black Sea region, and in a bonus segment for patrons, we talk about the perils of creating external enemies for political purposes, and the reasons behind U.S. sanctions and hostility toward Russia. Mark Sleboda is an international affairs and security analyst, a U.S. Navy veteran, a university lecturer, and a foreign policy realist. We recorded this on March 26th, 2021. Mark Sleboda joins the show. Thanks so much for coming back. Mark, it's great to talk with you again.
Thanks for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Appreciate it. So Mark is in Moscow, on the outskirts of Moscow, and very plugged into the scene in Ukraine for a whole bunch of reasons, including, knows and is related to a lot of people from Ukraine. I'm not surprised, Mark, that there is a return to a more hostile, not like it got great under Trump, but I'm not surprised that there is a return to the same kind of policies we saw under the Obama administration, who, of course, supported and backed the Maidan coup. And, however, I guess I didn't expect things to escalate this quickly. So from what we can see over here, we see things heating up again in the Donbas region. I see headlines about us sending some kind of ships over to Ukraine and plans to build naval bases in Ukraine. I see all of the news stories about the cruiser and destroyer ships now going through into the Black Sea again. And of course, every day it's Russia, Russia, Russia. Again, there is a new intelligence assessment about how Russia, not only did they meddle in the 2016 election, but they also now meddled in the 2020 election. Again, an evidence-less intelligence assessment, and lots of talk about even more sanctions on Russia. Lots of tough talk. And just to top it all off, we want to shut down the Nord Stream pipeline too. And I guess here's icing on the cake. I was looking at news stories, and I see this Voice of America interview with George Kent. Remember that guy from the impeachment? And he was bloviating about how things were going to be and talking about his former professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. You'll like this quote. My former professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, once said that if Ukraine succeeds, it gives the real impulse for Russia to have the possibility of reform in the long term. And so we treat Ukraine on its own merits, and that's why it's such a focus of our assistance that's provided by Congress. It's the focus of our diplomacy. We understand the great human potential of Ukrainians, whether it's in information technology, whether it's in agribusiness, whether it's in the dynamism of civil society. And we want to support that for Ukraine to succeed in its own right. And because we also understand that if Ukraine succeeds, then other countries farther to the east will understand that many of the false narratives and claims by Russia are simply not true. I think Zbigniew Brzezinski actually said that if you take Ukraine, Russia can no longer be an empire, and that's how you topple Russia. But I don't know if that's what he's referring to, but that's the kind of gobbledygook that this guy, we're back to this.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's old geopolitical thinking, geopolitical reductionism. I would even say that the idea that, without Ukraine, Russia is just a country. Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Well, that's kind of really overstating the importance of Ukraine, I think, for a lot of things. But Ukraine has been an example to Russia, but not the way the US neocons imagine. It has become the ultimate cautionary table.
Yeah.
We're talking about a country that, since the US-backed Maidan Putsch in 2014 overthrew their democratically elected, however flawed, government, Ukraine economic catastrophe, basically becoming an enemy state with their number one trade partner, still their number one trade partner, by the way, has resulted in that Ukraine, on a per capita basis, became the poorest country in Europe, poorer than Moldova, and that's saying something. So you can imagine what the economic crisis that has been happening in Ukraine as a result of that change of government and the geopolitical flipping of the country for the last 7 years now, because we're on the 7th year.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, as you mentioned before, my wife is from Crimea. My in-laws live in Simferopol, and we have extended family across eastern Ukraine, Donbas, Odessa, Kharkov. So I do, opinion is not at all unbiased, but I do speak with a degree of very sincere personal knowledge about all of these things.
And we know that, and we appreciate that.
So there's a lot happening in Ukraine right now. In a couple of years ago, the comedian Vladimir Zelensky became the president of the country in an election, defeating the US-backed oligarch, the Candy King, Petro Poroshenko, who was the one who came to power immediately after the Maidan Putsch in 2014. And Zelensky had, of course, no political experience, and he basically created a party from the ground up, the servant of the people, on the idea of throw all the bums out and start over again. And that, of course, included all the bums from the Maidan. But it led to a president and a government with absolutely zero real political experience. It turns out no more immune, I should say, to corruption than any previous government of Ukraine has been, and yet still following the foreign policy path of alignment with the West and confrontation with Russia that set the Maidan on its course. So that was a big carryover, despite the personal animosity between Zelensky and Poroshenko. And Zelensky came to office with a lot of hopes, promising to end the conflict in the Donbas, without ever saying how exactly he would do that. And when he took office, his approval rating was in the high 70s, around 75%. Less than 2 years later, his approval rating now is around 30%. His party, Servant of the People, is even less. And there are a whole host of crises and catastrophes going on in the country right now. And I think that we talked about Zelensky around the time of his election, and I'm pretty sure that I iterated to you a cautionary table not to expect too much good to come from him. And I hate to be the Cassandra again, but I think most of my predictions have fared pretty well about exactly what his presidency would mean and result in. First, economically, the situation in the country has not improved substantially since he took office. Ukraine is still in dire economic straits. It is still, the regime in Kiev is still existing on drips from the US controlled, US and EU controlled International Monetary Fund with 10 or 15 billion-dollar drips that keep propping up the regime in Kiev. The coronavirus pandemic has not improved the economic situation in the country any, of course. And as in a lot of countries, there is resentment over the piecemeal restrictions that the Zelensky regime has tried to enact on the country quite unsuccessfully. They're not dealing with the crisis well. They have a lot of deaths. Their medical system, already in very bad straits, is at the point of catastrophe. And they've had a big problem getting vaccines. They couldn't get any vaccines from the West. They couldn't get Pfizer. They couldn't get Moderna. They couldn't get AstraZeneca, because it turns out that the Western countries are all too concerned with getting the vaccines for their own people. And despite all the promises to the contrary, at the end of the day, Ukraine and Ukrainians just aren't very important to them. They're not a priority. In fact, they're on about the bottom of the list. At the same time, the regime in Kiev has forbidden the country to take Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine. In fact, they've referred to the vaccine as warfare against Ukraine. You know, the old slogan during the Cold War, better dead than red. Well, Zelensky, you know, better dead than with a Russian vaccine.
So he's taken that too, yeah. And are there excess of the Sputnik vaccine?
Oh, it would be very easy for Russia. Russia would provide a certain amount of supply. Russia has plenty of supply at this point. But for export, they've exported some. But more important, they just signed deals with the manufacturer. Ukraine has the capability to manufacture. They just don't have a vaccine. So that could be provided to them. Right now, they're getting basically just now, in the past couple weeks, they are getting an Indian vaccine, which basically is like a second-hand copy of AstraZeneca. And they're not having great results with it. And even that, they're having problems with the supply now. That is all that handling of the coronavirus crisis, the handling of the vaccine, you know, that has all helped tank one more factor in the mix. That is tanking Zelensky's approval and you know, at least the center of the country's love affair with him.
And how have they done with the corruption, with the anti-corruption efforts?
Yeah, that's just what I was getting to. There is a constitutional crisis in the country. And that is between the president's office and the constitutional court of the country. And it has to do over a lot of his demanded reforms for the anti-corruption and his anti-corruption special task force, Nabucco. The Constitutional Court basically declared a number of his anti-corruption reforms demanded by the US and the IMF to be unconstitutional. And a lot of that has to do with, of course, the uneven way that these were laid out, and then the beginning of their selective implementation. And that is because Zelensky basically adopted a policy that the oligarchs that support me, meaning, you know, that support Western integration, Western Ukrainian oligarchs mostly, are untouched, while we use these anti-corruption measures to go after Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs. Yeah. So they basically became a political weapon. He tried to basically dissolve the Constitutional Court and kick everyone off. And this political crisis continues in the country right now. And as a result of it, the IMF is withholding the latest tranche of IMF funds which the country badly needs. With all of this and his declining approval rating, he got hammered in local elections where his party, Servant of the People, won no local elections, no
Shocking.
mayorships
Shocking.
anywhere in the country. In the West, Petro Poroshenko's ultra-nationalist so-called European Solidarity Party won everything. And in the East, the, nominally, shall we say, pro-Russian, the really pro-Eastern Ukrainian party, the opposition platform Party for Life, which is essentially the successor to the Party of Regions that had the government when the Maidan seized power and was lustrated. And several years later, they've now reformed. They, by some measures, are now, by some polls, are now the most popular political party in the country.
I feel like we're
going back full circle. So there have been a number of measures that Zelensky, in light of all of this, has taken. He has, in recent weeks, banned some 15 media outlets in the country. Basically, all of them from Eastern Ukraine, representing the Eastern Ukrainian point of view. All of them supporting the opposition party Platform for Life, which he terms pro-Russia, but which is the largest opposition party in the country and maybe the most popular political party in the country right now. So all of their 5 major TV stations taken off the air. And you have to understand that all TV, all these big media outlets in Ukraine are owned by oligarchs. Ukrainian politics has always been about oligarchs and which oligarchs are on which side, and they're maneuvering around each other.
They already knocked all the Russian stations off.
Yes, Russian media has been banned from the country for a number of years now. Now that's not enough. Now they have to ban Eastern Ukrainian media, or as they refer to it, pro-Russia media, or the US often euphemistically refers to it as Russian-linked media. It's the media representing the views of Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs and to some extent Eastern Ukrainian people. On top of that, there are increasing calls for the opposition party to be banned, as the old Party of Regions was lustrated when the Maidan came to power, as the Communist Party of Ukraine was banned, and a number of other left parties were banned in the country. That is how the Maidan has kept political power in the country. It seized power, but then it purged all political opposition in the country.
Yeah.
And it's banned left opposition, which was the Communist Party of Ukraine was one of the more substantial political parties in Ukraine at the time, until the Maidan seized power. So now they've rebuilt, and political opinion started to shift away from the Maidan parties and Zelensky's successor party because of their failures in recent years, at least in the center of the country and certainly in the East, which never supported them. And once again, they are, using these heavy-handed political measures, which are not solving the political and social problems of a divided Western and Eastern Ukraine because of a divided conception about what Ukrainian national identity is and should be. One is a monist West Ukrainian ultra-nationalist conception that views the ethnic Russian and the, shall we say, pro-Russian or pro-Eastern Ukrainian mentality to be not Ukrainian and the enemy. And the Eastern Ukrainian point of view, which is that, all of their children, in fact, the majority of the people grew up speaking Russian. They view Russia as a brother country. It doesn't mean they agree with them on everything about everything. But by and large, they don't want to be part of an anti-Russian state that becomes a de facto NATO outpost pointed, right at their country. The number of Russian and Ukrainian intermarriages is such that, for a large degree in East Ukraine, it's impossible to identify what is Ukrainian and what is Russian.
Yeah, that's what Stephen Cohen used to say all the time, pointed out. The marriages, the other relations, and the number of people who work. Yeah, it's not even just the marriages. There's just so many, intertwined. Yeah,
that's a legacy not only of the Soviet Union, but of pretty much all of Russian Ukrainian history, going back hundreds, even 1,000 years.
Well, it's a land border, right? So yeah.
For most of the time, Ukraine is actually a rough translation, meaning the border area.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the border of Rus, of the Muscovite Empire as the successor to Kievan Rus, which was destroyed by the Golden Horde. That's ancient history. But by and large, there has not been any animosity between Russia and Ukraine, and that is one of the reasons why this new regime in Kiev so time and again resorts to the glorification of these West Ukrainian World War II Nazi collaborators, Bandera, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, despite the fascism, the participation in the Holocaust, the murder of Ukrainians by other Ukrainians, the massacre of Poles in the country, the willing Ukrainian fascism, allied with Nazi Germany.
And they're not reformed. They're not reformed, right?
No, they're not reformed at all.
Yeah, for anybody, people who don't know, they still are like literal Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, and the government in Kiev basically has to declare, these Nazi collaborators the founding fathers of the country and national heroes, and you're not allowed to question that. You're not allowed to actually, say actually they were Nazi collaborators in the Nuremberg, and you're not allowed to say things like that now. And the reason why is they are trying to build an anti-Russian Ukraine, and there is, in order for this creation of an anti-Russian Ukrainian nation, as with all construction of all nations, which they're not as organic as people think they are if you read into the academic literature on them. They do need a historical basis, and there is no historical basis for a Russian-hating Ukraine except for these West Ukrainian Nazi collaborators in the World War II era. And part of that is because that Western Ukraine, then Galicia, had only recently become part of Ukraine. It had been part of the Poland, Austro-Hungarian and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before that for centuries. And only just before World War II did they become part of then the Soviet Union and merged into Ukraine. So their conception of what Ukrainian identity is pretty much directly in conflict with that of East Ukraine, which even more than a lot of the rest of the former Soviet Union. It's not so much, I want to say, pro-Russian. They're not anti-Russian, but there's a lot of Soviet nostalgia. In fact, the West Ukrainians refer to them as Slovak. And that's a way of thinking of like kind of depicting a backward Soviet thinking people. And that is a very strong sentiment in Donbas, a lot of these regions, these industrial heartlands, where, even up until a few years ago, heavy industry, chemicals, metals, coal, these were the basis. And they quite often regret the security, the economic and job security of the passing of the Soviet Union.
So it's a good old days kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a bit of nostalgia. Again, with all such nostalgia, it's not that we want it back exactly the way it was, but we didn't want it to change as much as it did. So there's all of this repressing of the political representation of Eastern Ukraine that is once again occurring. Again, it was beaten down in 2014. It's now being beat again with media and political repressions. And the leader of the opposition party, a Platform for Life, is an oligarch, as again all of these leaders are. Poroshenko was an oligarch. Zelensky was backed into office by the oligarch Kolomoisky, Igor Kolomoisky, and Medvedchuk is now being targeted personally. Him, his family, and the other leaders of the opposition party for Platform for Life, they are being investigated for treason now.
So that's the head of the party, Medvedchuk?
Yes, Medvedchuk.
And Kolomoisky supports the Platform for Life?
No. Kolomoisky had, of course, supported the rise to power of Zelensky. But now the relationship between him and Zelensky is ambiguous. The U.S. has actually put sanctions on Kolomoisky.
I saw he was back in the news, yeah.
As well, over corruption issues and the question of private bank, and the fact that Kolomoisky is not completely on board with the United States. Doesn't mean he's on board with, so we say, pro-Russian Eastern Ukraine either, but he's kind of been playing his own game. And Zelensky he's directed his anti-corruption agencies to begin to go after a number of senior officers in Private Bank, which was the bank that was owned by Kolomoisky, and then was nationalized under Poroshenko. And Kolomoisky started making very disgruntled noises about the direction Ukraine was taking under Poroshenko. He basically he created Zelensky. His show ran on Kolomoisky's network, and he promoted him for the president. And now Zelensky may be going after some of his people, but no investigations or criminal charges right now are against Kolomoisky himself or the co-owner of Private Bank. So Zelensky may be trying to make some gestures to appease the U.S., going after some people in Private Bank while not touching Kolomoisky himself. It's unsure whether that will be enough.
Is he still there in Ukraine, or is he in Switzerland or Israel?
Yeah, he has citizenship in several countries, so he goes back and forth between Ukraine and Israel and Switzerland, and several other places. God knows where he owns property around the world. He is still an extremely wealthy man, but yeah, he is nominally still in Ukraine. But he is certainly among the many ranks of the disgruntled in the country right now. So all of this economic and pandemic and political is leading to a resurgence of military tensions in the east of the country. And in the last few weeks, the Kiev regime forces have begun moving a lot of military forces to the Donbas border. Troops, tanks, artillery pieces, even ballistic missiles have been seen making the transit. And the shelling of the Donbas has increased to a level not seen in several years. And there is a lot of talk about the potential for military confrontation. A lot of the idea being that Ukraine will make some kind of provocation, and then, as far as they're concerned, they're not fighting Eastern Ukrainians. They're not fighting the people of Donbas. All of their propaganda, something that, of course, is echoed by the United States and the EU media, is that they're fighting Russia, right? People in Eastern Ukraine, they don't exist. They don't have separate opinions. They're just not mentioned. It's just Russian. They're just fighting, or maybe Russian-backed separatists or Russian-linked this. Again, it's about crushing the political representation and the national identity conception of the people of Eastern Ukraine. I don't think the Ukrainian military is certainly much large, still mostly draftees, but it's certainly much larger, better equipped. Trump started supplying it with lethal arms. Something actually that Obama never did. There's this myth that the Trump years were somehow better with relations with Ukraine and Russia, but that's not true at all. In fact, they were worse. Trump started supplying lethal weapons. Not that those particular American lethal weapons are so important, but
yeah, I mean, it's not like they can't get them, but
yeah, it's the supply of other weapons that they can actually regularly use and have supply chain parts for from Europe and other post-Soviet countries.
So now they're on the NATO. Sorry, are they on the NATO standard weapons now?
No, not complete. No, not by a large stretch. They're still on their old weapons for the most part. But they have gotten a significant amount of NATO training, and by and large, the military has been completely purged of anyone not loyal to the Maidan regime. And you have to understand that in 2014, when the government was overthrown and all this went down, there were literally tens of thousands of defections from the Ukrainian military, from the Ukrainian police, from the Ukrainian security services that went to either Donbas or Crimea, which means Russia. And one of the worst affected was the Ukrainian Navy, particularly with its home port in Crimea. That was the center of Ukrainian naval activity. By even Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's reporting on the topic, 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Crimea or Donbas.
Did they sail some of those ships, give over some of the ships and things like that?
Yes, yeah. Well, most of the ships, and of course, all the naval infrastructure was taken over by Russia. Russia did give back the majority of the ships, not that they were in very good condition. Actually, when they were taken, Ukraine's Navy wasn't in good condition then. But you can imagine that in 2014 that Ukraine didn't have much of a military. Its military did not respond to the demands from the regime in Kiev at the time to go into conflict against Donbas, to take Donbas by military force and make them accept the change of the government in Kiev. The military couldn't respond. This is why these far-right paramilitary battalions, Azov, Right Sector, Tornado, all of these were formed at the time because the Ukrainian military wasn't responding. But in the preceding years, they've managed to build together a more coherent force, certainly in numbers and also to some degree in quality.
Well,
I do not think that they could.
Won't they also need to demonize the people in Eastern Ukraine?
They've been doing that for 7 years.
Because
they've been doing that for 7 years.
Because this is when I first came across you and your work and things like that. There was a group of people who was watching in real time what was going on at that. And there was footage. There'd be people on the ground with footage. And I couldn't always understand what they were saying. If I was lucky, someone who spoke English like you or that other guy from Britain. But you would see footage of they'd roll the troop carriers into these towns and cities in Eastern Ukraine. And, people would come out of their houses and the women particularly would just start scolding them. Saying, what do you do? What are you doing? And
forming around the troop carriers.
And the troops tanks would slink away. They'd be like, "You're right. What am I doing here? These are my own people." And this used to happen all the time.
Yeah. Until they had enough problems with this, and they didn't have enough of the paramilitary battalions that were willing to engage. So then they just started artillery shelling.
Yeah, right.
Cities of Donbas, and then that escalated, of course, to aerial attacks against the cities of Donbas. And again, it's this idea that they're not like us, and part of the mentality is certainly, and it's been repeated on Ukrainian political talk shows in Kiev and everything, is ethnic cleansing. Make all these pro-Russian Eastern Ukrainians go to Russia, drive them all out of the country, or make them submit to our conception of Ukrainian national identity, which means they will speak Ukrainian. They're not allowed to speak Russian publicly. And all these restrictions against the Russian language have gone through. Now in Ukraine, there was just in the last few months, there was a new law passed if you are a waiter that replies to something, replies to a customer in a restaurant in Ukraine, in Russian without
Oh my
being
God.
addressed in Russian first. If you simply say thank you in Russian,
Or
spasiba,
da or spasiba.
you
Yeah.
can actually be fined and face jail time, theoretically.
Which something you've
This is
been
the
saying
level
your
of,
whole life, right?
yeah, this is, I mean, again, and most Ukrainians up until 2014, Russian was, Western Ukraine, to the far west, an exception to that. But the majority of Ukrainians, Russian was their first language. Russian was what they spoke on a daily basis, and it certainly was the academic language and the business language, and so on. And this policy of radical forced Ukrainization, it's viewed, of course, by them as a way of reversing centuries of forced Russification, as they call it. But a lot of the truth is that these people in Donbas, as far as living memory, they always were Russian speaking. And a lot of them are Russian ethnic, up to 30% of the population there. And then there's that blurred line between all of the intermarriages and so on. What is even Russian and ethnic Ukrainian?
And probably a mix of languages, like everybody in the world now says okay.
That's called, the mix of Russian and Ukrainian is called Surzhyk. And that's actually now also basically outlawed. And the most hilarious thing about this, of course, is that the president now, Zelensky, he had a big film history, as a comedian, a lot of comedic films. Most of his films, of course, were in Russian. And a lot of his films are now banned in Ukraine. No. His own films. I mean, that's the insanity of all of this. There is a potential for military conflict, not because I think that Ukraine thinks it can militarily take or even wants to take the Donbas militarily by force. If it took it, it would have to politically integrate it, and that would be a lot of problems for them. They can't politically integrate it. But they want to have a successful enough offensive, I believe, to force Russia to intervene directly on Eastern Ukraine's behalf, to protect them and their political and social rights there. And they will use that as fodder, Ukraine and the United States, to force Germany to kill Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipeline, the second gas pipeline under the Baltic from Russia to Germany. The U.S. is sanctioning German and other European companies involved in its construction to try to kill it. It's very near completion, upwards of 90% done at this point. But the Ukrainian regime and the Kiev regime regards it as an existential threat to their continuation. One, because it will deny them the political leverage, control of those pipelines represented over Europe. And two, because of economics, because those gas transit fees, which Russia and German consumers, because some of it was passed on to them, had to pay, is a not insignificant part of the Ukrainian economy. Yeah. We're talking billions of dollars a year. And they and Poland actually both stand to lose that money. And in fact,
certain oligarchs, like mark it up and pocket,
that was Tymoshenko. Yeah, the gas princess.
Yeah.
She's still there, and that was how she made her fortune, of course.
So they buy the Russian gas, they mark it up, and then they pass it
resell
along.
At a higher cost. Without these gas transit fees, Putin has even talked about it, that the U.S. is so much against it. One, of course, because they would prefer that Germans buy twice as expensive or more American liquefied natural gas. But the geopolitical connections, and they want Russia to continue to pay gas transit fees to Ukraine. And Putin has called that America demanding that Russia continue to subsidize America's geopolitical project in Ukraine. And from the Russian perspective, that's what it looks like. In order to sell their gas to Germany, they have to pay a fee to an enemy government that is, positioning itself against them and opening, serving as a de facto naval NATO base against them.
Well, isn't it, Mark, not just the money, but the leverage? They
Yeah,
would always be able to.
Geopolitical leverage.
Oh, well, if you don't do, we're going to shut off your gas.
And they've done that before.
Yeah.
And there's all this. Oh, Russia uses energy as a weapon. Actually, it was Ukraine that used energy as a weapon. When they couldn't pay their own bills, and this had gone on for some time, Russia stopped the flow of gas that amounted to their percentage. So what did they do? They shut down the gas to Europe, or they siphoned off gas that was intended for Germany and other countries in Europe.
Did they change the direction of the way the gas went in some cases too?
They've managed a reverse flow where now Ukraine, the government in Kiev likes to claim that it is now not buying Russian gas, when it is simply buying Russian gas at an extra markup from gas that is coming from other European countries and being reverse flowed back to them, which is just insane. But again, it's all about image, and Russia is the enemy, and so on, that they're trying to perpetuate there. Along with this possibility of renewed military conflict in East Ukraine, whatever the actual goal there, be it Nord Stream 2 or an actual conquest, there is also increased military activity in the Black Sea.
Yeah, that's scary.
Ukraine is completely devoid of, it has a small naval base in Odessa, but they of course lost most of their ships. They've entered into an agreement with the United Kingdom to build 2 new naval bases, one of them in the Black Sea, one of them in the Sea of Azov.
Yeah, I saw that. Where, Mariupol or somewhere?
Yes. And that would be funded by the UK.
Isn't it too shallow?
It is. Yeah, it is. At some points, it's like 15 feet deep. Conventional military naval vessels don't work there. If you ever see reports about submarines in the Sea of Azov, that's
yeah.
I mean, you need special shallow hold boats, shallow bottom boats that are specifically designed for operating in the Sea of Azov. Yeah, but that, again, it's more of the militarization of Ukraine as a de facto NATO base against Russia, where it goes to the point where the UK is, the West is not only supplying with the government in Kiev with weapons and money to construct their own weapons, but is now even paying for military bases to be constructed for its use against Russia, which is, of course, part of the whole rationale with the reunification with Crimea in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy. Again, referring back to Stephen Cohen, if instead of the whole Maidan thing and the connection with the EU, if instead they had negotiated a deal where they maintain the relationship with Russia, so they still have some economic benefit there, and make a deal with the EU too. There were people trying to say, maybe Putin even made this suggestion, it's like, why do they have to pick sides? Why do they have to only be allied with Russia or the EU? If there had been some kind of a custom deal, like, I feel like none of this would have happened.
Before 2014, Ukraine was actually already in a free trade agreement with Russia and the other members of the Commonwealth of Independent States. The West was pushing this EU association agreement that in the end resulted in tens of thousands of pages of neoliberal shock therapy diktat to the country. And during the negotiations, the Ukrainian president at the time, Yanukovych, and this is not remembered, but Yanukovych was actually pushing the EU association agreement.
Yeah.
He was actually campaigning for it in Ukraine to his own Eastern Ukrainian base until he saw the final document, the final diktat, and said, I can't do this. This will destroy our economy. This will destroy our country. It will destroy me politically. It will unemploy tens of millions of state workers, right? It will destroy our country. I can't do this. Not without, he was expecting some 15 billion or more in Western funds to help ameliorate the shock therapy effects that were codified in the EU Association Agreement, and they offered him nothing. So at the end of the day, he then walked away and said, no, or not now, not under these terms. And that led to all of this. But all along, he had been asking the EU that when they were writing the association agreement, let's work out a deal with the EU and Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine existed for 20 years by not firmly taking sides between Russia and the West. That's how the political balance in the country. It was both foreign policy and domestic, because this domestic politics, this East-West, this conception of Ukrainian identity, Ukraine maintained its independence and stability as a unified state by not taking sides, by not choosing. And Russia and the government in Kiev then, Yanukovych, said to the EU, let's come up with a joint deal here, that we get an EU association agreement, but we maintain some kind of relationship with Russia. And the response from the EU at the time was no. And the EU president at the time, the council president, said, Ukraine has to make a civilizational choice. They forced them to make it. And 7 years later, and the conflict in Ukraine that's going on now, and it's not simply something that is again forced on them by Russia or entirely by the West, it must be said, because there is this societal national identity divide in Ukraine itself about what it means to be Ukrainian, right? Western Ukrainian sense of national identity is Ukrainian mono-ethnic, and it is very anti-Russian. And that's a legacy of their history: Galicia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Nazi collaboration. Or in East Ukraine, it is not, and they do not want to be made into an anti-Russian state. They're happy being somewhere in the middle. They were content with that. But in Crimea, it was, of course, much less content, where there is much higher pro-Russian sentiment. In fact, it's been said that there's higher pro-Russian sentiment in Crimea often than there is in Moscow, which is the most liberal city in Russia, with a potential up to 15 or 20% pro-Western liberal political sentiment in the country. That's kind of a joke. There's Crimeans that say we annexed Moscow, not the other way around. There's very, very much very patriotic pro-Russian sentiment in, like not all, but 90-some%, 93, 94% of the Crimea and the Crimean people.
Well, I mean, that could be a demonstration of what you said earlier in the conversation, which is, and just to clarify a little bit, when Mark was saying that, Ukraine is an example to Russia, the NATO, the US and the NATO side were saying, well, we are going to create a Western-oriented Ukraine, and everyone in Russia is going to look over there and say, oh, we want that too. And that's going to cause the transformation of Russia. And what Mark was saying was, well, they did provide an example to Russia, but the opposite message is what is coming across. And it sounds to me like maybe the Crimeans are feel like that, it was a near miss for them. They almost
in the last year, a member of Zelensky's own Servant of the People party, a female member of his party, a Rada representative, went to the Crimea, and she saw, what has happened in the Crimea in the last 7 years, and she went back and went on Ukrainian TV to the Ukrainian media and said, Actually, Crimea is much better under Russia than it ever was under us.
Uh-oh, what happened to her?
All right, so there were immediate calls for her to be tried for treason and everything there. But yeah, that's definitely not what they wanted to hear. In the last week, Zelensky has enacted a number of new sanctions on Russian companies, Russian media companies, including TASS, which were already banned in the country, but this is basically seizing their assets in Ukraine as well. Russia Today, which includes RT, Sleboda, which is Russia Today, which includes RT and Sputnik, TASS, a number of online platforms, Gazeta, Lenta, and others. But they, amongst all of this and sanctions against another 82 companies, another 100 Russian individuals, and a number of Eastern Ukrainians, there was also on there a number of European Parliament MPs. Ukraine sanctioning more, because they've already done it before, more members of the European Parliament.
But
because these members of the European Parliament went to Crimea and they observed elections there. And that is regarded as a crime against Ukraine. And it's rather hilarious because recently in tit-for-tat sanctions, China responded back to EU sanctions by sanctioning a number of members of the European Parliament. And there's all this outrage. How dare they? How dare they? And then Ukraine goes around and in the same week sanctions a number of members of the parliament, and it's crickets chirping.
Just because they because they went
to the Crimea and observed elections there and gave it a clean bill of health and said, it's not the narrative. It's about narrative management of what has happened there and what the situation is in the rest of Ukraine compared to Crimea, of course. But the fact that they can get away and not a word is said when they sanction a handful of EU parliamentarians who take a different foreign policy opinion than most of their peers in the parliament, and not a word is said about it.
So sanctions, Russia. So here comes another round of sanctions, supposedly. I mean, at this point, you got to wonder what's left to be
there's not
sanctioned.
Much. There's not much to sanction.
What do they want, Mark? What do they want? What do they want Russia to do?
They don't want anything. Russia. Oh, I mean, they've enacted demands. Of course, they know that these are never going to be met. Their demands are Russia turns Crimea back and Donbas returns Crimea over to Ukraine and stops supporting the people in Donbas. And so, that of course things are never going to happen.
Are they serious about that?
No, they aren't. That's not what these sanctions are about. These sanctions are not about Russia. They're about domestic politics in the United States. They're about satisfying an anti-Russia demand by the Democratic Party, by the blob, the US foreign policy elite, to do something, to express outrage, to further demonize Russia, to justify militarization against Russia, increased military spending, and the like. They know that these sanctions have no effect on Russia. In the very beginning, the US has very little economic leverage over Russia.
Man.
Did you know that even today, that the U.S., Obama was very famous for saying rather ignorantly, and it really points to how intelligent his Russian advisors are, that Russia produces nothing that anyone wants, which my immediate response
was rocket engines.
Yeah, we're putting your astronauts into space. They can't get there, recently until Elon Musk, and now they're doing it again because they know they can't rely on Musk. But on top of that, there is a $16 billion trade deficit in favor of Russia with the United States today, still today. In fact, Russia is now the number 3 supplier of oil to the United States after Canada and Mexico. Venezuela, the U.S. shot itself in the foot because it's sanctioning Venezuelan oil, which was one of its own supplies with its regime change sanctions on Venezuela. And supplies from Saudi and the other OPEC countries have been declining. So Russia has snuck in after Canada and Mexico as the third biggest exporter of oil to the United States, some 7%, which is like some 530,000 barrels of oil a day.
I didn't know that.
That is just recently the numbers have come out. And this is at the same time that the U.S. is sanctioning EU countries and companies, trying to blackmail and threaten them. You aren't allowed to build another energy pipeline between Russia and you, because it's hurtful to your energy security to be dependent on Russia, even as the U.S. is increasing the amount of Russian oil that they are buying. It's so hypocritical. It's hilarious, and you wonder why. The old saying, you wonder why they hate us, and you wonder why Europeans are becoming so disgusted with the United States. Something that had a policy that hasn't changed from Trump to Biden, and Biden's just doubling down on it. But yeah, there's a $16 billion trade deficit. Oil's a part of that. It's not the only thing. But U.S. sanctions have never had much effect on Russia. Even at the biggest height in the very beginning, 2014, 2015, the U.S. Treasury Department assessment was they cost Russia a little bit less than 1% of its GDP.
I would say that they caused, well, I don't know, maybe this is not really true. It's just a line, but it seems true to me. They caused Russia to be more self-sufficient too.
Exactly. Yeah, well, not so much that.
For an energy-dependent country, that's probably the best thing you could do for them. The same thing's going to happen with Venezuela, because, countries that have a lot of oil and gas, they get lazy. They're like, we'll just buy, we'll just buy this, we'll just buy that, and then they can't make anything for themselves.
Russia has been decreasing its reliance, again, stereotypes, headlines, reality. Russia GDP, the percentage of their GDP that comes from oil and gas in Russia is like 12% right now. That's it, 12%. Russia has a fully developed economy.
Yeah, that's very much more healthy than something like Venezuela. Yeah.
The sanctions and counter sanctions, Russia's counter sanctions against European countries for joining in with the U.S. sanctions. Russian agriculture has had a boom for a decade, for the last 7 years. It's huge business in the country now, which Russia really needed. They joined the World Trade Organization too soon and opened themselves up to all these cheap Western products and goods. Now there's been an agricultural boom in the country. Russia is once again, for like the fourth year in a row, the top wheat exporter to the world. Russian agricultural exports this year increased another 30%.
30%?
30% in 1 year. Because of bad harvests in the West and the pandemic in China. But consumer demand has also been fueling this economic boom. It's also been very good for domestic manufacturing and industry. Not quite as good as agriculture, but good as well. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I don't want sanctions to end. I don't. They're very good for Russia. They're very good for our economic independence and even our export to other countries. They've been a huge boon to the Russian economy and Russian economic self-dependence. And I want that type of economic decoupling from the West. I don't want it to go away.
I mean, they're terrible for American companies.
Oh,
particularly when they're critical infrastructure type products, let's say. And I'll use Venezuela as an example. When do you think the next time Venezuela is going to buy an American-made elevator or electrical grid infrastructure product? When they
Does America make elevators?
I think
aren't they all made in China now?
Well, there's, the Venezuelan electrical grid. They couldn't get spare parts, and it fell into disrepair, which everybody said was Maduro because he's a socialist, and whatever else.
U.S. electrical grid in Texas doesn't look that great either from my
Well,
point of view. Maybe someone should overthrow the U.S. government for negligence.
but there were also things like the elevators weren't working in buildings. I think they were having a hard time keeping their trains running and things like this. But any of those products, maybe they were American products, maybe they were American allies who pressured them into, also imposing the same kinds of pressures and sanctions. But when's the next time you're going to buy a really big, important product from the States when you know that the risk of um, almost arbitrarily some American president declaring you some kind of a state of emergency and, sanctioning and shut down the pipeline for even your spare parts? So what are you going to do next time? You going to buy American? No, you're dooming our industry.
Yeah, I mean, not that there's that much industry there, but one firm example of that is Boeing, which invested a lot of money in Russia. They found a skilled, intelligent workforce that knew everything about building airplanes and other high technical things. They invested a lot of money here, and they've lost a lot of money over the last 7 years as a result of decreased trade. And at the same time as Russia experienced a 30% increase in agricultural exports this year. Trade between Russia and the EU dropped by 20% in the last year. Now, a big part of that is, of course, due to the pandemic, but it is a further sign of decreasing of this decoupling, something that the US is intentionally trying to do, and to force Europe and its other allies along with China to economically decouple with China. But this decoupling is happening at the same time between Russia and the West, and Russia's not suffering from it.
Can we go back to Boeing for a second?
Yeah.
What was Boeing going to do? Were they going to open factories?
Yeah, they had factories here. They have offices here.
I didn't know that.
And Russia's a big source of aluminum, which of course is a primary component of making airplanes. So Boeing had invested a lot of money here, and I don't know all the details, and Russia hasn't imposed specific sanctions on Boeing, something I actually advocated for. They haven't, but Boeing has suffered because of the general economic malaise and probably because of some US sanctions. And their business, they've lost a lot of money here in the resulting last 7 years.
So they probably hope to sell the commercial jets in that market as well, right?
They had one time. It's not going to happen now. Russia and China are now building a joint consumer aircraft that will, be a 737 equivalent. Boeing has lost any such hopes of selling aircraft to the Russian government. That's for sure.
I haven't heard good stories about flying Russian commercial jets from people who used to live there.
Actually, Russia's safety record is no worse, and in some ways, I would say a little better. I actually would prefer to fly. There's some smaller airlines that I wouldn't fly in Russia. There's also some smaller airlines in the US, budget airlines, that I wouldn't fly either. But I would much prefer to fly Aeroflot than US Air. Russia's Aeroflot pilots, I think, are probably among the best in the world.
No, it wasn't the pilots that they were talking about. It was the planes.
Planes, yeah. Well, again, Aeroflot's planes, again, are they have a very high safety and maintenance record. So I think a lot of that is
improved.
Yeah, is things that are lost in translation in media reporting.
Could be. So if you don't mind, can we roll into a bonus question, which is just going to be a sort of conclusion? If we're not really targeting Russia, if this is really a domestic issue, the way that you described
part of it is to demonize Russia, but yes, also
yeah, and
demonize, isolate Russia.
And of course, we always need. Well, you need to justify these giant budgets, right? And they would like to justify budgets for the big things, which was not convenient in the Desert War.
Yes,
and there's the branch competition for money and justification for spending and all that. But also, we always need an external enemy, right? If you have an elite establishment who is facing a populist uprising, who's worried about their popularity and things like that, which we definitely do have, well, then you create an external enemy, and that draws the attention off of you, and it directs the anger and action against this external enemy. That's the ideal thing, right? That's what you would try to do. So my question to you is, does that backfire? How far do they take that? Do we end up in any kind of a war with Russia? Because there are also people who are saying, hey, look, China's the real problem here. And you can't let this Russian-Chinese alliance flower any more than it already has. And you need to get Russia on yours. Well, it's a bit late, right? Because of Ukraine. So talk to me about where you think this could go, if you would.
Yeah. The answer to the bonus question is in the extra bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to all bonus content by subscribing at Rockfin or Patreon, plus other perks like patron live streams, Zoom calls, and access to our Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my pitch, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up.
Mark, how can people find your work, follow your commentary, and all of that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. I'm on Facebook, of course, Mark Sleboda, or you can look me up. The search is Gramsci there. But I'm also on a lot of Sputniks, political talk shows several times a week, sometimes several times a day. So you can certainly find me there, and I'm always doing the odd interview around RT, CGTN, Al Jazeera, even occasionally someone like France 24 and the like.
Do you tend to post links to those on your Twitter feed so you can follow you that way?
Yes, not often enough, but I will try to double down on it.
Yeah, because, should do that. All right. Thank you so much. Great talking to you again.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to the next one.
Take care.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Mark Sleboda. Follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSleboda1 and on Facebook, and look for his appearances on RT, Sputnik, and other international channels. This podcast is independent media. Listener support's important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod, and Rockfin. You can find it on any podcast app or on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Rockfin, Patreon, on YouTube. Some new platforms coming soon. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.